Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Better Work Summit. This is being run as part of the Better Work Network, which is run by the Learning and Work Institute and with the kind support of the Trust for London. And we're very grateful for their support for the network and for today's summit. My name's Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute, and I'm chairing this morning. I know that there's lots of you on Slido watching this event, so please do put your comments and your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try and pick up as many of those as possible as we go through. Please do also use the Twitter hashtag if you're on Twitter, and that's Better Work Summit, and there you go, even a QR code for you to snap to go straight through to Slido there. So please do put those comments and questions in. Please do tweet away. So just a few words by way of introduction from me first. So we've got a really good lineup today. You can see the list of speakers we're going to run through. And I was reflecting back, it's a few years now since we set up the Better Work Network at a time before the pandemic. If anyone can remember back to such a time, it feels like 1,000 years ago now. And at that time, employment was quite high overall across the UK, lower in London, but relatively high overall. And so the concern was more, there was definitely further to go on raising employment and making sure we cut inequalities between groups. But the bigger focus perhaps was about the quality of work, and thinking about what does good work mean? How do we help people progress from low pay rather than just getting stuck there? And then along comes the pandemic and changes everything, but in a sense also changes nothing. And we're now sort of coming through perhaps hopefully the worst economic effects of the pandemic and starting to think again about, well, how do we recover from that and how do we renew? What sort of labour markets do we want in London? And took London vacancies a bit of time to recover compared to the rest of the country, but vacancies are now above pre-pandemic levels. We know that there are anecdotal reports of some employers struggling to fill their vacancies, but lots more to do to deal with the unequal effects of the pandemic that have hit some groups and areas harder than others. And we know that London's labour market has been harder hit than many other parts of the country due to the nature of its reliance particularly on commuters and tourism, for example, and driving that central London economy. So where do we sit now? We've got employment still a bit below where it was, definitely. We've got big questions about the extent to which people are going to sort of flood back to offices, and so the central London economy will return to kind of how it was, or has everything changed and we're all going to keep zooming away from spare rooms if we're lucky enough to have them. So there's big questions about what that future holds, and I think also our concept of what good work means or what better work means has probably changed a bit as well. So probably includes things like health and safety relating to coronavirus now. So have you got a safe working environment, as well as things like progression and opportunities for development. So it feels to me like better work is a really key part of how we recover from the pandemic and the sort of labour market we want to build for London, and about how we tackle some of those pre-existing inequalities between groups and areas that have been exacerbated and highlighted by the pandemic. And I think for us, as we go through today, we're going to be talking a bit about our Better Work audit a bit later, which tries to get some measures around good work, because it can mean a lot of different things. It isn't just about pay, it's about much more than that. I'm really proud of the fact that through the pandemic, we tried to listen to the voice of Londoners in low paid work to see what they thought was important as well. And we've tried to reflect that in some of our measures. There's a question about what we mean by good work, and then a question about how we try and expand that as we recover from the pandemic and go into the world beyond. So that's really the focus for us today. What do we need national policymakers to do? What do we need the Mayor and the GLA to do? What can local authorities do? And what can we all collectively do as commissioners, policymakers, practitioners and employers as well? So some pretty big questions for us to tackle, but we've got a great lineup to do that. And so without further ado, I'll move on to our first speaker, Clara Skrivankova, who's a grants manager at the Trust for London. And Clara, as I said, we're really grateful for the Trust for London support for the Better Work network. So I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak at the summit. For those who are listening and who have not come across the Trust before, just a few words about who we are. We are an independent foundation that exists to tackle poverty and inequality in the capital. And we do that mainly by giving grants to civil society organizations and community organizations, and also through our social investment arm. In addition to funding, we also use the knowledge and the experience that we have, and also our independence, to bring a broad range of stakeholders together, and also to bring together those with lived experience to tackle underlying causes of poverty. And the Better Work Network is an example of such an initiative. And as Stephen has said, the network was set up a while ago, I believe it was about 2013, really to help identify ways to deal with in-work poverty and explore the idea of what better work means. From when we set up the Better Work Network, from the work that we have been funding, we knew that low-paid workers end up trapped in low pay. And it's not just about having a job or any job, it's about having a good quality job. And over the past decade, in-work poverty in London has become a really huge issue, despite the fact, as Stephen has already said, we saw at the same time unemployment dropping. So in the years before the COVID-19 pandemic, about 51% of Londoners who were in poverty were also in work, so quite a significant number. And it was at the same time in a period where London's unemployment dropped by nearly 10%. So you could see there was a significant disparity. So in a way, the rise in numbers of those in work pre-pandemic has obscured the increase that we saw in the numbers of workers who were stuck in low pay and on insecure contracts. And we know that workers in low-paid jobs were also the ones that were hit the hardest by the pandemic. They were more likely to be furloughed or lost their jobs, which is something that the Living and Work Institute research also showed last year. And that's why Trust for London has been focusing on good work, or decent work, if you will, work that delivers a fair income, security in workplace, better prospects for personal development, and the freedom to express concerns and organize at work. And progression out of low pay, insecure work is one of the key aspects of that. And that's why the Better Work Network remains our flagship initiative in this regard. Over the years, we have invested in a number of projects and initiatives like the Step Up program, some of you might be familiar with, which was a program that was aimed at finding new approaches and ideas to help workers progress out of low pay. You may also know that the Trust has been supporting for a very long time the Living Wage campaign and was behind the setup of the Living Wage Foundation. Wage, of course, is one of the key indicators when it comes to decent work, but true good jobs offer more than just a living wage. They also provide guaranteed hours, options for workers, and decent working conditions. By contrast, even some of the workers who are paid living wage at the moment still face cliff edges because their job is precarious or insecure. They have no guarantee of hours. They might not have access to employment benefits and all the rights. They might be in places where conditions of work are poorly monitored because of lack of transparency in procurement and outsourcing. We at the Trust see good work as one of the key ways out of poverty. We also recognize that to address the inequalities in London's labour market, employers and businesses have an important role to play. The increase in business models based on churn, outsourcing, and temporary contracts that was designed primarily to cut labour costs has been a contributory factor to the rise of in-work poverty and job insecurity. At the same time, employers are realizing that business resilience and future sustainability is better secured when workers feel valued and respected. And some studies have started to appear showing that those businesses that were following that path seem to have fared better during the pandemic than those that didn't. For example, the Living Wage Foundation accredited employers also report better staff retention, improved work-life relationship, and increased business reputation. We are also seeing increasingly that investors pay attention to how companies treat workers, and that was recently demonstrated by the impact of investor concerns over workers' rights on the price of Deliveroo's shares. Working with business and employers is therefore key to achieving and maintaining the values of better work. Within our Better Work program, we fund a number of organizations that engage with employers, often as critical friends. For example, since last year, we've been funding a new project run by the Social Market Foundation that's looking at the role of London's business in tackling poverty. And they recently surveyed about 500 London businesses and found, when they questioned those businesses about poverty, that most of them have concern over poverty, and more than half of all of those firms, and there were firms of all sizes, agreed that workforce poverty in particular should be a concern for London's businesses. And quite a few of those, 39%, of employers that were surveyed admitted that more than half of their London workforce is somehow directly affected by poverty. It was also encouraging in that piece of work that 70% of businesses said that they would be willing to take some additional measures to help address poverty among their own workers, which suggests there is a considerable appetite among businesses to do more than they're legally required in addressing poverty into capital. At the same time, while many businesses are willing to take steps to become better employers, they do not always know what to do and where to start. And of course, that's where the Better Work Network and the work of the Living and Work Institute becomes really important. And as you know, that the Institute looks regularly at what it is that workers actually believe constitutes a good job. And that's why it's also very important to listen to workers, to engage with those who have lived experience, because they are effectively the ones that are able to tell employers what they need to do to achieve shift towards decent work. We at the Trust put emphasis on initiatives that are led by those with first-hand experience, and this includes ensuring participation and representation of workers in transforming their workplaces. And as the Better Work Network continues its works in this direction, there is also a very strong commitment to have people with lived experience at the forefront of the efforts to ensure that people can progress out of low-paid, insecure job into decent work. And we very much look forward to working with the Living and Work Institute and the Better Work Network members and many others on this journey. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Clara. And I think some really helpful and important points there around the context, both in terms of what we mean by good work. And as I said before, you know, I mean, salary matters, but also it's about more than that. And also in the context of the wider work that the Trust for London is doing on this agenda as well, which is really, really important. So we've got great initiatives there. And I think also setting us up nicely for the discussions a bit later about, you know, there's something about what are the legal minima, you know, where do we set the floor, and also how we get adherence to that. But then also, you know, how businesses go beyond that and making the business case for this. And we'll hear from sort of employer representative a bit later about some of that. This isn't just a burden or an imposition on business. This makes good business sense. So thank you very much for that, Clara. I think that sets us up really nicely for the rest of the discussion as well. And as I say, thank you to the Trust for London's I hadn't realised it'd been that long, to be honest, for the ongoing support for the Better Work Network. You made me feel old now. It's been going on for that many years. But so thank you very much, Clara. So next we're going to be hearing from Rajesh Agrawal, who's the Deputy Mayor of London for Business. Now, I always wanted to, we've had the Emmys recently, haven't we? Lots of award ceremonies, and in true award ceremony fashion, I get to say, unfortunately, Rajesh can't be here today, but he has sent us a recorded message. So we'll hear from Rajesh now.
Thank you to the Learning and Work Institute and Trust for London for inviting me to open the 2021 Better Work Summit. This network is more important than ever as we move into a new phase of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has triggered an economic crisis that has pushed many people over the edge into hardship and harm. Many now risk long-term unemployment, affecting their future earnings, job prospects, and health and well-being. But it doesn't have to be this way. As we rebuild, we can reprogram our economy to create secure employment, reduce poverty, and expand prosperity. Better quality employment and fair pay are central to ensuring no one is left behind. As Deputy Mayor of London for Business and a business owner myself, I am aware of the key role that employers can play in creating positive change, especially in a difficult and uncertain environment. The Mayor and I support employers to improve their work practice through the Mayor of London's Good Work Standard, a free of charge accreditation scheme setting the benchmark for best employment practices. To accredit, we ask employers to meet high standards in pay and contracts, skills and progression, employee well-being, diversity, and recruitment. Over 100 employers of all sizes and sectors have joined our community since its launch in 2019. Over 235,000 Londoners now work for a Good Work Standard employer. I hope that many of you here today will consider joining our community. The Mayor has also committed to expanding the Good Work Standard with a new program specifically aimed at the needs of micro businesses. During this term, we will also introduce new charters of good work for the gig economy and for organizations who work with freelancers in the creative industries. The Mayor's Employment Rights Hub supports employees in workplaces where they are not afforded fair treatment and pay. This online resource helps Londoners better understand and enforce their rights. The Mayor has pledged to making London a living wage city region during this term as part of his commitment to tackle low pay. Led by the Living Wage Foundation, this campaign will bring together employers, local communities, borough councils, workers, and industry representatives in a focused collective action to increase the uptake of the living wage in our city. Since 2016, the number of living wage accredited employers in London has doubled to over 2,200. Nearly 90,000 Londoners receive a pay rise each year when the new living wage rate is announced. The Mayor and I are committed to making London a fairer city, and we have set out a missions-based approach to meet this ambition. One of the 9 missions is good work for all Londoners. Our ambition is that all Londoners, particularly those hit by the coronavirus pandemic or Brexit, can access education, training, or work. The Mayor has prioritized using the adult education budget of £330 million per year to deliver this, alongside a new £32 million Good Work for All fund. We have extended eligibility to fully fund Londoners earning below the London living wage. London's first ever citywide anchor institutions charter was signed by 14 organizations this year, including major employers such as the NHS, the Metropolitan Police, University of London, and Transport for London. And by working together, they can support the capital's economic and social recovery by supplying good jobs that pay at least the living wage and greater procurement opportunities to local SMEs. I encourage the larger organizations at today's event to consider how you can affect change and model best employment practice in your communities and supply chains. The pandemic has prompted important questions about how we work, keeping workplaces COVID secure, managing hybrid work patterns and teams, and ensuring employee well-being in this new context have become core issues for how our organizations functions. As you take part in today's discussion, I'd encourage you to think about how good work fits for your organization in the new normal. When we all work together, I know we can build a brighter, fairer, and happier future for everyone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to Rajesh for that speech, and also to the GLA more widely for their ongoing engagement in our work. And I think we're going to pick up some of the themes that Rajesh was talking about there, and I can see questions are coming through on the app as well. So please do keep those questions coming in, and we'll cover as many of them as we can. I can see Lindsay's asked about how the sort of views of workers and low-paid workers have informed or are informing some of the stuff we're doing through this. And I know, well, I hope anyway, I've now sort of basically prompted Naomi to, I'm sure she'll go into anyway, to talk about how those views have informed some of the work we've been doing. So I'm going to, I mentioned earlier that we've done our sort of first Better Work audit to try and get at some of the measures of good work and how London's doing on those. And they are indicative. It's actually, I think one of my key takeaways is it's really difficult to measure, but I think we've got some decent indicators. So I'm going to ask Naomi Clayton, who's a Deputy Director here at the Learning and Work Institute, to run us through some of that. And then we'll introduce our other two panelists, and we'll have a discussion based on some of these issues and some of the questions coming through on the app. So please do keep asking and tweeting away. So Naomi, sorry, I've dropped you in it there. You've now got to cover, I think you were going to anyway, but I'll pass over to you to talk about our Better Work audit.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. And I will touch upon how the views of workers in London and particularly low pay workers in London have informed some of the work, particularly around the Better Work audit. So I'm going to take you through the findings of this audit, which examines the quality of work in London over the last decade and how that's changed. Through the audit, we've tried to look at job quality from a range of different dimensions, and we've used the Good Work standard and the set of metrics that were developed by the Carnegie UK Trust and RSA as a framework for that work. And I should just say thank you to the team at Learning and Work for all of their work on this. So through this audit, we've looked at change in the decade prior to the pandemic, and then where possible, we've also looked at what's happened during the pandemic to explore how the crisis has impacted on the quality of work in London. So if we just go on to the next slide, I think this really forms the kind of context for the audit, in that prior to the pandemic, job creation in London accounted for 1 in 3 jobs in the UK, and the employment rate was at a record high. So you can see on the chart here, in blue, we've got the employment rate for the working age population in London, and you can see that that's steadily climbed over the decade prior to the pandemic. But the extent to which this has been accompanied by increases in job quality is probably less clear cut. And certainly we've seen over that decade, following the financial crisis, a steep fall in household incomes. So that's the orange line on this chart. And that has followed the steep fall in real pay growth over that time. So if we look at household medium income, when we adjust for inflation, we can see that over the decade prior to the pandemic, medium household incomes in London have risen by just 0.6% over that time. And if we put that in the kind of wider context, that represents the largest peacetime drop in living standards in 2 centuries. There's been a lot of work done on this, and generally the decade prior to the pandemic was seen as kind of the lost decade in terms of pay growth and living standards. And the result of that was, prior to the pandemic, and Clara's spoken about this, prior to the pandemic, 1.6 million Londoners were living in poverty, despite having at least one person in their household in employment. So quite a significant rise in in-work poverty. So if we go to the next slide, this is just an overview of the different measures that we've looked at through the audit. Because clearly, when we're thinking about job quality, pay is just kind of one element, albeit a very important one, of job quality. And as I said before, this kind of framework is built on the work that Carnegie UK and the RSA have previously done, looking at how you might measure job quality. And we've also used the survey that we conducted over earlier this year, looking at what Londoners view as most important in terms of employment and job quality. So you can see that 52% of workers in London consider an adequate salary to be one of the most important factors in a job. And to measure this, we've looked at the proportion of workers who are paid below the voluntary living wage. We've also looked at kind of terms of employment and how kind of the use of different types of contract are changing in London and have changed over the last decade, coupled with kind of unsatisfaction of those terms of employment, particularly for temporary workers. This does relate to job security, and workers, 22% of workers in London consider a secure contract to be one of the most important factors, one of the most important things that they're looking for from a job. We've also looked at kind of job design and the nature of work, focusing on the opportunities that are being provided by employers for development and progression at work. We've looked at representation and voice through changes in trade union membership. And then lastly, looking at work-life balance. This again was one of the most frequently cited kind of top 3 most important factors when we surveyed workers in London earlier this year, the importance of having a good work-life balance. And our measure here looks at overemployment. So the proportion of workers who would like to reduce their hours, even if it means being on lower pay. The sixth area is around kind of well-being and support at work. And of course, this is a really important kind of element of good work and job quality, highlighted again by the workers that we surveyed earlier this year. But we haven't included it in this audit, partly because there's limited availability of really kind of comparable and reliable data at the regional level. But it is worth saying here that other studies that have looked at changes in job quality over the last decade, last few years, have found that work has become more stressful in general. And when we surveyed workers, we found that 2 in 5 workers, or 39% of London workers, have felt unwell due to work-related stress during the last 12 months. So it is a really important factor, but not something that we've included in the audit. So just to take you through the key measures, the first one, if we go to the next slide, looks at the proportion of workers in London, and I should say we've looked at how this compares to England as a whole and the devolved administrations as well. And we've looked at those other areas across the measures in the audit. This first one looks at the proportion of workers earning below the voluntary living wage. So this is the rate set by the Living Wage Foundation. There's a separate rate set for London, which is set a slightly higher rate because of the cost of living, and it's designed to reflect the level of pay that's required to achieve a decent standard of living. So here we can see London in the orange line on the chart. Generally, a lower proportion of workers in London earn less than the living wage set at the London rate. But we've seen a slight rise in the proportion of workers earning less than the living wage compared to 2012. I think it's also worth highlighting here, we've highlighted 2016, the introduction of the national living wage, which generally across the UK has had an impact on pay at the bottom of the distribution, has meant that we've seen quite significant pay growth amongst lower wage earners, and a drop in the proportion of workers who are earning below the voluntary living wage as a result of that. But it's had, or at least it appears to have had, less of an effect on the proportion of workers in London who are earning enough to afford a decent standard of living, partly because it has less bite in the capital, because average earnings are higher anyway. So 1 in 5 workers earn less than the voluntary living wage in London, and if we look back over the last decade, that has we have seen an increase in that proportion. If we go to the next measure, on the next slide, we can see that there have been some changes in the use of what we've termed atypical contracts in London. So here we're looking at the proportion of employees who are on temporary 0 hours or on-call contracts. And I think it's really important to say here that I think it's not clear that the use of these types of contracts necessarily have kind of negative implications in terms of job quality. They can, in some cases, offer workers flexibility and allow them to work in a way that suits their needs. But it's also, as many have pointed out, can lead to job insecurity because these aren't kind of standard kind of permanent contracts that many who are working within organisations and for businesses have. So, but over the last decade in London, we've actually seen a drop in the use of these contracts. So a drop in the proportion of employees on temporary or 0 hours contracts, and it's fallen from 9.3% to 7.4% in 2019. And alongside this, when we look at the proportion of temporary workers who don't want to be on a temporary contract, so involuntary temporary work, we can see that that's also, or had also fallen prior to the pandemic. So from around 32% to just over 20% to 2019, which I think you may well take to represent kind of greater satisfaction among workers who are on these forms of contracts. But the pandemic, as you might expect, has reversed some of these trends, and we've seen an almost 3 percentage point rise between 2019 and the latest available quarter in 2021, with more workers on these forms of contract, and more workers being dissatisfied with that, with being on a temporary contract. So we're seeing some of the kind of cyclical effects and a reversal of some of the trends in terms of the use of atypical contracts prior to the pandemic. On the next slide, we've also looked at the proportion of employers who are providing development opportunities for employees. Generally, opportunities for development offer staff pathways to develop their skills, their capabilities, and offer routes for progression in work. But we've seen quite a significant drop in the proportion of employers who are providing these development opportunities for staff. So it's dropped from 75% in 2011 to 62% in 2019. And it's worth mentioning, as we found in one of our other recent reports, that training in more recent years, employer investment in training has also fallen, which may well have knock-on impacts for employees' ability to and opportunities to progress in work. The next slide, we've looked at trade union membership as part of kind of measures to look at worker voice and representation, and we can see again there's been a slight fall in the last decade in the proportion of employers who are trade union members in London. It's lower anyway than other parts of the UK, in part I think because of the sectoral profile of London's economy, and that has fallen over the last decade. And then lastly, the measure of overemployment that relates to work-life balance. And if we look at change from 2011 to 2019, we've seen that there's been an increase in the proportion of employees who would prefer to work shorter hours, even if it resulted in less pay, which suggests that more workers are struggling to find a good work-life balance in London. So just in summary, because I'm conscious of time, to go to the next slide. Clearly, we've seen unprecedented job creation in London over the decade prior to the pandemic, but that didn't necessarily lead to an increase in the quality of work. And on a number of our measures, we have seen a fall or a slight fall in, for example, the trade union membership, employers providing development opportunities, the proportion of an increase in the proportion of London's workers on earning beneath the London living wage. So whilst we've seen quite substantial job creation, that's not necessarily led to an increase in the quality of work. And clearly the pandemic has had quite a significant effect on the quality of work, and had quite disproportionate impact on low paid and insecure workers too. I think it's worth noting that, and our wider research shows this, that the experience of work and access to job quality varies within London too. So our previous research has found that older, low income and part-time workers are less likely to feel positive about their opportunities for progression. And we may well see a widening of inequality in terms of access to good quality jobs in the recovery. So we need to make sure that we're working to avoid that, and to make sure that we are really levelling up in terms of job quality in the recovery. And partly that means utilising a whole range of policy solutions to support that, which I'm sure we can discuss further in the panel discussion. So I will stop there.
Great, thanks, Naomi. So I think that kind of hopefully gives a sense about where some of the data is. There's no perfect measure of this, but we've got some indications, and based on what low paid Londoners told us and other work that others have done elsewhere, I think, it looks like some things definitely got worse, some things got a little bit better before the pandemic, and then some things were sort of broadly the same. I can see lots of questions coming in via Slido, so do keep those coming in. I think there's which we'll kind of pick up now with our panel, which Naomi is going to be part of, and I think some of those are about what should happen to minimum wages. So do we want to, what should be the level of the legal minimum? How do we build on those who've already signed up to the voluntary living wage and try and expand that a bit further? Some about the support that people need, whether that's English classes or what the skills are that people need for jobs that are around. What about support with costs? Like housing is obviously a massive thing for London. And then also I think a really interesting question we might sort of pick up on as we go through the discussion, which I was kind of alluding to a bit earlier actually, about what the last year or so has done to our view of what good work actually is, and how it plays out in practice. So, both for key workers, but also, for the increased availability of flexible or home working in some sectors, has that kind of been a good thing for some of that work-life balance we were talking about, or actually does it risk blurring the boundary between home life and work life? So I think what good work means in the context of the changes the pandemic's been brought about, I think would be interesting to get into. So I'm going to ask our other two panelists just to give a sort of a brief intro for sort of 3 to 5 minute Max about some of the issues they've been hearing about and what their organisations are doing, and then we'll get into the rest of the discussion as well. So I'll start by introducing and asking to speak first James Wingerath, who's from Youth Employment UK. So James, over to you for sort of reflections on what you've heard thus far and how you see things from your perspective.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So I'm just trying to, you'd think after 18 months of being in lockdown, I know how to take my own camera off for a Zoom. So no, thank you for that introduction. Youth Employment UK, we're a not-for-profit organisation that was set up in 2011 to tackle youth unemployment. And key to our expertise and insight is the voice of young people. And one of the ways we gather this insight is through an annual youth voice census, a piece of research that provides a temperature check on young people's barriers and experiences as they transition into employment. This is quite timely because last week we launched the 2021 Youth Voice Census, which was the biggest census yet, both in terms of the number of young people that participated, but also the questions we asked. We had just short of 3,500 young people sharing their views on a range of issues across the education, work, job hunting, and impacts of COVID-19 and much more. The findings are weighted and therefore represent young people aged 14 to 24 across the UK. And the report is available to read on the website. The QR code is there. We're very excited by this. This is our first QR code as Youth Employment UK. And if you click on that, that will give you the full report. What this report does is it helps develop our services, supports the employers in our network, and helps government officials develop policy that truly reflects the needs of young people. Today, I want to briefly share with you the key findings, but also the key data sets that we think employers really need to hear. What was clear from the data this year that there's been a real disconnect between young people and the opportunities available to them. Only 9.9% of young people think that they will find good quality jobs where they live. Now, this might come as a bit of a surprise to many of you here, who I know are committed to supporting young people and providing quality opportunities, so we will come back to that stat. But the key findings of the Youth Voice Census are focused in on 4 areas: mental health, catching up on experience, accessing quality work, and no space for young people. Mental health was a primary concern for young people who took part more than ever across all age groups. Young people think their mental health, anxiety, and in some cases, depression is a barrier to their employment. Young people's mental health is affecting their motivation to find employment, and only 24.7% of young people think that they can access support for their mental health problems. Catching up. We know, of course, young people have missed out, like a lot of us, on some of those key experiences due to lockdown. But young people missed out on so much more, and they told us this, that they know they're missing something: work experience, completing exams, career support, events, volunteering, extracurricular activities, all the things that employers are looking for. We're already talking to employers such as Coca-Cola, Morrison's Utilities, APG, a food manufacturer, about how we help reset recruitment practice and bias that often look for these experiences that young people have just not been able to have and achieve over lockdown. Young people told us they had no space. We heard young people tell us they didn't have access to devices, quiet places to work, but that also they did not feel safe and confident in their own communities. Some of them have lost confidence in the systems around them, particularly government. They do not believe that the Job Centre or National Career Services are places for them. I just want to go back to the accessing of quality work. As mentioned, 9.9% of young people do not feel that they will be able to access quality work. We have a huge amount of data that begins to uncover what some of this really means. Only 42.7% of young people in school had access to a careers advisor. This is less for graduates. Young people are not confident that they have the skills and knowledge to prepare for or attend an assessment centre. Only 30% of young people think they've had good personal network to connect opportunities. And only a quarter of young people think employers are supporting of hiring them. When in work, and I think this goes nicely with the Better Work audit findings, around the proportion of employers providing development opportunities, only 6.7% of our respondents said they got additional workplace training. One of the comments was, stuck in a career development at entry-level role seems really hard to jump to more senior roles. So I think that's quite a good reflection on the findings of the report. Young people are not sure that they have the skills employers are looking for, or they have the experience they need. Also, and this is a key takeaway, they are struggling to connect to opportunities. There is so much information out there that they are overloaded and able, without the right trusted support, able to navigate that information. The traditional recruitment and engagement methods are just not working. There are 5 more steps that need to be taken before employers really reap the benefits of a young workforce. But given the economic and labour climate we have, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reach full youth employment. Employers need young people, and young people need youth-friendly employers. So thank you very much for your time.
Great, thanks, James, and definitely supporting the Q&A there for the points you were making about mental health, or that were coming out of the audit of the survey on mental health provision as well. And I think also a handy chance for me to plug a Learning and Work Institute report as well about employer investment in skills, which the team have popped into the Q&A there, which really reinforces your point about, we showed a chart showing development opportunities going down in general, but it is that other report shows young people being hit hardest by that, and actually government policy actively reinforcing inequalities in access to training at work rather than trying to tackle them. I'll just ask you one quick question before we sort of bring in our final panelist, and then a broader discussion as well. So somebody's asked about how we share the views of young people with employers to help shape what employers focus on and do. So I think, given you've just been talking about that sort of voice of young people, that's probably an opposite question to put to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we have something called the Good Youth Work Charter. So we encourage employers to engage with us. We engage with employers direct. There's no cost for it. And it's about supporting those employers in how to word job applications, job adverts, the job descriptions, how to promote themselves as, being a sector or an organisation of choice that's going to offer those progression routes, whether that's through, work experience, through training, through offering an apprenticeship, a career. But I think, I highlighted it in my presentation, that when job descriptions are asking for that work experience, young people just do not know now what to put down in that. And it can be something as simple as volunteering at the local Riding for Disabled, or, gardening, at a local country park, whatever it might be. It's, we're working with young people to help them build that up into their CV, into their skill set, but also now, on the other side, trying to help employers understand that is key valuable experience in terms of communication, using their initiative, and being able to get out there and do something.
Great, thank you, James. Keep those questions coming in. As I say, we'll cover as many as we can as we go through. But in the meantime, I'm just going to introduce our final speaker, Jane Wiest, who is the Diversity and Inclusion Policy Lead at the Federation of Small Businesses and the owner of Initially London. And Jane, I think you're going to talk a little bit about the importance of good work from a business perspective and from the FSB's perspective, and then also your experience, sort of running a business and owning a business through the pandemic, and what this sort of area means to you. So over to you, Jane.
Indeed. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. Such interesting discussion so far, and I can't wait to hear what the panel discussion brings up as well. We can move on from this slide quickly, please, to get my face off twice. Just to sort of reiterate from the business perspectives, the landscape shift has been remarkable over the last 2 or 3 years in employment, certainly for employees and definitely for employers. the pre-pandemic gig economy was extraordinary. The way, this shift, and that the chart that Naomi put up about workers valuing time, their own time over their pay, was really reflected in the rise of the gig economy. And certainly the use of technology to hire and to recruit and to put your credentials out there really helped that rise. And that made hiring quite easy. And then, of course, when the pandemic came, that gig economy turned into a double-edged sword, because the system of support, which certainly with furlough, favored those employees with permanent contracts. And those employees without the permanent contracts really suffered. And whether that was fair or not remains for history to judge. But now, in a sort of post-pandemic environment, we now need to figure out, how do we make good work make business sense in really a quite difficult business environment, certainly in London, where the cost of doing business is so high and employee costs are the biggest costs that we shoulder as employees. Next slide, please. Just a bit about my company. I won't bang the drum, but just to show you why I think I've been asked and what my perspective is. We're monogrammers. We basically specialize in putting your initials embroidered on a whole range of accessories and linens. And that means that we're not just retailers, but we're also manufacturers. And we're manufacturing in London, which is a bit of a challenge given the space constraints and the staffing constraints. And we have both a retail and a trade business. We're based in Fulham, which is right smack in the middle of the city, but also a very sort of business-friendly council where there are really interesting spaces, hybrid spaces, where you can both manufacture and retail. However, our premises costs and our labor costs are huge. When we went into the pandemic, we had 7 contracted employees and a host of freelancers, the marketing people, the web people. We used the furlough scheme for the people that couldn't come into work, which were the embroiderers. You can't embroider if you don't have an embroidery machine and stock. And we had a lot of working from home for the people who did the admin work. And then I basically went into the studio myself, sort of running, cycling, walking, staying off of public transport to keep the business ticking over until we could bring people back. And when we brought them back, most came back with huge enthusiasm, because they're people that liked being out at work, making and doing, although a couple, because furlough allowed them to work at different jobs while they were on furlough, had sort of developed another career alongside, and then decided they didn't want to come back to their old job when they had the opportunity. We used the softness in London real estate, in office and retail real estate, to move premises about earlier this year, as soon as the second lockdown ended. And that allowed us to actually add staff, which is an indication of less the health of the retail environment and more the craziness of a business owner who decides to double down when things get tough. But it did seem it's a good time if you're trying to find space. This is a really good time to do it, because there is more softness than there had been certainly 2 years ago. And we hire basically within the design and craft and fashion industries, which are industries that are notorious for low pay or no pay in some cases, certainly in entry-level jobs. And they're all also very female orientated or populated industries. And that, I've seen some pretty dubious hiring practices in those industries, of people extending 6-month unpaid internship opportunities and thinking that's a good thing for young college, university educated girls. And we can argue about whether that is or isn't, but I think it isn't. Next slide, please. So if we're trying to create good jobs, I guess the issue is always going to be defining good. And defining good is going to depend whether you ask the worker, whether you ask the company. And even amongst workers and companies, you're going to have a whole host of different answers. And interestingly, Naomi's chart showing that 39% of workers value their personal time, which is only just behind the 42% that value what they're paid, shows that the pay isn't always what makes a good job. You need a good environment, you need stability, you need it's going to be there through good times and bad, whether you're ill, whether you're healthy, whether you're happy, or whether you're sad. And you also need to know as a worker that you're going to progress and that you're going to grow in that job. As an employer, unfortunately, it's always going to be the cost, isn't it? Employers are trying to hire as cost effectively as possible and always will, because it is your biggest cost. But at the same time, you want reliable, effective, honest employees who are going to help you drive your business's success. And so reconciling what's good for both employee and employer is the art of hiring, I think. But I think ultimately you need to treat your workers like they're professionals, and whether they're, at the very lowest entry level job or the most, senior experienced professional, everybody wants to feel like their work is valuable. And that makes a good job, I think, if people feel like they're valued. And contracts are part of that. A permanent contract is an expensive, terrifying proposition, but it protects both workers and employers, because things in the lifetime of staff go good and bad. And it's kind of discouraging to see that the rise of the not good contracts is happening. And I don't really understand why, but I think that needs addressing reasonably quickly. And then creating job progression encourages longevity, and longevity is what you want as an employer, because the more experienced your staff is, the better you are and the better they are. So ultimately, you need to invest in your staff the way you invest in the equipment and technology that you use to run your business. And that's with a really long-term view. Unfortunately, unlike equipment and technology, you can't defer with staff. You can't defer the expense. You have to pay it. It's always in cash, and there's no interesting tax treatment or deferral treatment. It's a hard cash outflow. So next slide. That leads to how do you encourage people to take that on? And part of it, obviously, is regulation and making sure that employers are doing the right thing for their employees. But you have to do that in a compelling way. Colloquially, more carrot, less stick, I've said. Or else it's so heavy-handed that you don't hire at all, and that you do resort to the zero contract wages or zero wages contract, 0 hours contract. Sorry. And I think, more ways to recognize living wage employers is one step, but ultimately it comes down to helping, like tangible help. There are some incredible grants, and have been incredible grants through the pandemic, that I hope will stay in place. We've used the Kickstart scheme, which is fantastic. We've hired a young girl off of universal credit with support with the Kickstart scheme, and she's fantastic. We've just applied for a second, really talented young girl that we wouldn't have found had we not been encouraged to look through the universal credit Kickstart scheme. I think you also need to offer free resources to businesses. We use the London Business Hub quite extensively, and there are lots of resources out there, but the more that are out there to support employers and help employers figure out how to train employees, how to offer free training opportunities, that helps a lot, because if you're really struggling to pay a good wage, you're probably going to struggle to pay for training programs. So free training resources is fantastic. And finally, you need policy support. And I'll speak with my Federation of Small Business hat on here. I would scream all day for the need to raise the small employers allowance for national insurance credits. It's at £4,000 now, and that's not enough. I would ask for new grants. for hiring, and I would offer tax incentives to small employers to hire, whether it's to hire youth, whether to hire sort of industry-specific roles. It just seems wrong to me that you can capitalize the long-term costs of investing in machinery and software, but you can't do that with staff. So you can depreciate expenses with machinery and software that last over a bunch of years. But if you hire an employee that you want to keep over a bunch of years, you can't capitalize any of those training costs or hiring costs. And that just seems inconsistent, particularly in the kind of work culture we have now, where the trend is to automate away the mundane jobs, the repetitive jobs, and replace those jobs with machinery or software that you will then capitalize. It seems like we've got to restructure a bit of the tax code or the incentive programs to help employers with their training. So those are a few of my thoughts from the deep pits. Hopefully, other people have some ideas as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jane. That was really helpful, really interesting, and lots for us to pick up on there. I guess, maybe one thing to pick up on first with you is you were kind of. I'd definitely like to pick up during the course of the discussion. By the way, what you were saying about good work can mean different things to workers as opposed to employers, and actually sort of pulling some of that apart, I think would be really helpful in the discussion. But I think I just want to pick up on something you were saying latterly there actually first, which is you talk about basically how do we persuade employers to sort of think about good work or to change their practices in some of the ways that we're talking about. Is it, you know, what persuades you as an employer? What would persuade? I know all employers are different, but what should we be focusing on here? Is it, you know, this is a good thing to do, or is it that things like the good work standard that the Deputy Mayor was talking about, is that a good selling point to get good employees and customers, or is it some of those financial incentives you were talking about, or is it the other thing? The other bit I've got in my bonnet, I think, is work we've done with employers around T-levels, for example. Lots of employers say they're interested, they want to get involved, but actually there's a sort of galaxy of acronyms and different government departments saying, please do this, that, and the other. And whether it's, you mentioned Kickstart, there's T-levels, work experience, work placement, sector-based work academies, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it's just, I'm trying to run a business, I haven't got time to understand all these acronyms or work out what you want me to do. So there's a kind of simplification point. So it's probably all those things and more, but I'm just interested what you think would be most persuasive for businesses.
Right. Well, I mean, I think an important point you mentioned is that so many differences come from different businesses. You know, if you're running a hospitality business or you're running a tech business, obviously your needs are quite different. So from a staffing perspective and from a employee development perspective. But ultimately, it's good for business. If your clients know you're treating your staff fairly, that's got to be good for business. It's got to be. I care about that. Hopefully, I think most people do these days more than ever. Now, that will always translate ultimately into a higher price point. But, you know, so you have to figure out how much do I care? But, you know, that I think is training, and that's our new, I mean, that's got to be the priority, doesn't it? You know, you don't, and it's certainly happening in the fashion industry where people are realizing that it just doesn't feel good to wear clothing that costs £2, knowing that someone did not enjoy making that garment at all. And that's got to filter through all of our industries. You've got to know that the person who brings your food when you order Deliveroo is paid properly, and the person who takes you home late at night in your car is paid properly, and the person who makes your, you know, whatever it is you're buying is paid properly. That's got to become an important part of the way we live. It's got to.
Well, let's pick up on that with Naomi then, because one of the sort of discussion points, I guess, with everything here is the extent to which you set a legal set of minimums and the extent to which you try and persuade or exhort or incentivize or encourage employers and others to sign up to various things or to do things differently. And the pay point is something that's come up in the discussion. So there's lots of, you know, we've now got record vacancies. but employers in some sectors saying they've struggled to fill those vacancies. One of the responses to that you would expect is to raise the wages, although that means ultimately customers have got to pay at the end of it. And there's a question about care workers, for example. You know, it's clear we don't put enough money into social care. And sorry, these are my words now, not the question, but we don't put enough money into social care in terms of the size of the service, but also the paying conditions for those working in that service as well. So what's your kind of sense or view about the extent to which we actually just need to increase the legal minimum wage to living wage levels or even beyond, versus trying to encourage those living wage campaigns that several people have talked about so far? So they're kind of, where should the floor be, is the legal minimum, and where is the sort of encouragement to go beyond that?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So we've done work with Carnegie UK on the future of the minimum wage. And the work that and research that we've done kind of highlights, as I mentioned earlier, the impact that the national living wage has had on low wage workers and the kind of bottom of the income distribution, and that's been, you know, largely positive. And so our recommendation was that government should maintain its commitment to increasing the national living wage, and as that increases further, look at ways in which you can make sure that you limit any kind of job losses as part of that. Generally, I mean, you know, kind of debate when the kind of national minimum wage was introduced was that we're going to see lots of job losses. We haven't seen that. So there is certainly an argument for pushing that further, continuing to be guided by the Low Pay Commission. I think there's potentially a slightly separate set of questions around the extent to which we introduce a higher youth minimum wage. Certainly further research needed in terms of whether whether there's kind of, it's feasible and there's merit in introducing a regional or a London-based minimum wage. I mean, I talked about the fact that the national living wage has less bite in London. I think there are lots of potential kind of downsides to introducing regional wages in this country, in terms of, you know, our kind of geography and our makeup. We look very different from the States, and in terms of governance, where they have kind of regional and local minimum wages. But I think, you know, it's something that we need to continue to look at, alongside potentially looking at kind of minimum wages within different sectors. But I think all of that needs to be coupled with the continual kind of leadership and kind of rollout of the voluntary living wage. As you know, obviously the GLA and the Mayor of London are doing a lot of work around the voluntary living wage and living hours too, which has had really kind of positive impacts. And then I think, in terms of coming back to the care sector, it's partly about the degree to which we value care work. And I think the recent debates and kind of actions around increasing investment in social care are really important from that point of view. And we need to think about the quality of care work as part of those debates and the kind of future of thinking about the future of care work.
Indeed, yes. I fear that some extra tax revenue coming in 3 years' time to mostly protect assets of people accessing care and potentially substituting public spend for private spend isn't going to raise the the way to pay those care workers. So I think what you've probably, there's an extra, if anyone wants to fund an extra Learning and Work Institute project looking at this, we'd be very happy to do it. I think there is a point about we should valuing care work, and we just need to pay people more, give them better terms and conditions, and that's going to cost us, but not doing it costs us in a wide range of ways as a society, I think, as well. Anyway, so I'll get off my care sector hobby horse there. James, if I can go across to you. So we've had 2 once in a lifetime events in the last 15 years with the great financial crisis and then a pandemic. And we'll have to hope these things don't come in threes, won't we? And this has had bad effects for all of us, and that lost decade that Naomi was talking about in terms of incomes, but particularly affects those entering the labour market and those young people trying to start out, and then disrupted education alongside that during the pandemic that you talked about. We're now in a phase where hopefully, I mean, who knows? The one thing, we can't predict these things very well, we know that, but hopefully we're sort of through the worst economic effects of the pandemic and the economy looks like it's recovering. We need to maintain it and grow it further. You talked about sort of young people missing out on those work experience opportunities, and you know what's happened with the education system and all that sort of stuff. I'd mentioned apprenticeships as well, which went from low 5 years ago to very low after the apprenticeship reforms to very, very low through the pandemic. So there's a whole set of disrupted opportunities. Now that we're hopefully in something of a recovery phase economically, what would you say, and from your Census as well, what are the sort of priority areas we need to focus on for young people in particular?
Yeah, I think the priority around the Census was that young people just did not know what opportunities there were available. So around 20% did not know that they could go and do an apprenticeship, which is it's a significant number when you think about the opportunity of leaving school, going and earning while you're learning, and the progression and the careers that are available to you. Now, I'm fortunate that I've got a 16-year-old boy who's just done his GCSEs, and at school he was just told it's A-levels. There was no go out and see what these options that are available to you. And I think particularly within the pandemic, we've got two generations of GCSE cohorts and A-level cohorts where they were in school one day on the Tuesday, sent home, and then got an email saying don't come back. So again, that lack of knowing where to go for those opportunities and the ideas. Apprenticeship numbers, yeah, they were suffering before the reforms, even more so now. Interestingly, there was a presentation on just before you guys that I was listening into where they're saying that numbers are still down and going down, and it's in sectors like the creative sector. In tourism and leisure where it's seasonal. So I think some work needs to be done around, addressing, yes, a 12-month apprenticeship, but if you work in a sector like holiday parks where it's very, March, April through to October, November, you're never going to get to do your 12-month, full apprenticeship. So what flexibilities can be included in there as well? So I think, yes, it was, the way the questions divert people, there was a small proportion of people that were asked around apprenticeships, how they felt that they were being mentored in the workplace. Only 3% felt they were being mentored appropriately. But again, very difficult with it being the pandemic, that in order to do an apprenticeship, you need to be with you need to be with your mentor. You need to almost be in the workplace. We made the conscious decision to come back into the office at the end of the first lockdown because we have 2 apprentices, and it was really important for them to be engaging with people on their day-to-day. We've also now just taken on a Kickstart young person, and again, if he was working from home or he wasn't able to come into the office and get that training experience, it just wouldn't be worth their while.
Right, thanks, James. And I think the sort of information on the opportunities available kind of crops up time and time again, and actually links, Jane, to something you were talking about in terms of employers knowing, kind of what's out there and where some of the support is as well. And I wanted to pick up, as I think I mentioned before, something you were saying about good work might mean different things from an employer perspective or a business perspective as opposed to the employee perspective. So I'm kind of interested to sort of pick up on that a little bit. So we kind of ran through a list of indicators which were based on surveys we'd done with Londoners and also work that others like Carnegie had done. Were you kind of looking at that and thinking, oh, well, from my perspective as a business owner, X is missing, or is it more about how you interpret or apply those different indicators? Are we kind of missing something by looking at it from the employee perspective, or is it more a point of interpretation, I guess? What does good work mean to you as a business owner?
Well, the whole employee, sort of the legal infrastructure in this country is heavily skewed towards the employee rather than the employer. And so you do, and that's right. It makes your life difficult in some cases, but it mostly makes your life better, because a happy, productive employee comes to work on time, does their work properly, is honest and has integrity and a lot of job satisfaction. And that turns into a good product, whether that person is a chef or a waiter or a chambermaid or someone manufacturing heavy goods or light goods. You want a satisfied employee. And so the infrastructure and the benchmarks need to be skewed towards finding and ensuring, regulating and ensuring that the employee is happy. But you can't make it such a burden from the employer's perspective that it becomes too intimidating. And that statistics showing, the rise of Naomi had a word for it, and I can't remember what it was, but the bad contracts, that is really discouraging. That shows you that, it is intimidating as an employer to take someone on a permanent contract. And whether that's because they're worried about the future of the business, and this is a tricky time to plan, clearly, or whether it's because they just don't like having all those responsibilities to their employees. So, there's a fine balance there, but, what makes ultimately the result should be that you're hiring great people who want to stay with you and help you grow your business if it's all done properly.
I think atypical was the word we used, and
atypical.
It's actually
it's not bad. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Well, that's the thing, actually, because actually some people are very happy in temporary work, and that's what they want, or 0 hours contract or whatever. So it's kind of is more or less a good thing. So I think it's the way we try to interpret it is it's good to have a diversity of different types of ways of working, because that makes it more likely you'll find some work that suits you. And actually, a business may not want someone full-time permanent, but sort of part-time every now and again may work for the business as well. Indeed. The problem comes if it's a one-way street in favour of the employer, and it's kind of it's not the employee's choice. So I think we were kind of reassured pre-pandemic, Naomi will correct me if I go astray here, that actually the proportion of people who were in temporary work who actually wanted a permanent job had fallen, and that the job satisfaction of people in temporary work had risen. So it kind of felt like where we were there was a better place, but then we've had that change in the pandemic, like you say. Jane, so if I just sort of point this next question to you as well, just because it kind of flows on from that discussion a bit, really. And just you were talking a bit about your experience through the pandemic, and you've kind of got more employees now, I think, than you did beforehand. I'm just interested in your experience of that sort of initial working from home phase that you were talking about, and then the sort of coming back, and whether that flexible working gave people good work-life balance because they didn't have to commute in, or did it sort of mean that there were no boundaries between home and work, and so it just becomes a bit of a nightmare? And just your kind of experience on that from your employees' perspective and your own perspective.
I think again, it's very industry specific, isn't it? If you are a sort of an office-based business where people are very much sitting at a desk staring at a computer, working from home probably works really well for you and does give you better work-life balance. But if you're a manufacturer or in the hospitality industry or retail, that obviously doesn't work for you at all. I personally don't like it. I think we're a creative business, and I think when you have creative people working for you, they need to be in a room together, because the synchronicity that happens with ideas and the exchange of ideas is just better when people are together. And the typing of issues down in an email that is worded correctly so that it doesn't offend and it communicates the idea, the amount of time that goes into that and deciphering emails that aren't written well is infuriating. So I'm not a huge fan personally. It doesn't really, we muddled through with it, but I was very happy, and my team was very happy to get back together. I also think the boundary issue is a big one. You're paid to work 9 to 5. And you turn up at 9 and you go home at 5, and you don't think about it again until 9 the next morning. But that's harder when you're at home.
Absolutely. James, sort of similar sort of question for you, really, I guess. I mean, you talked about Youth Employment UK's experience, but also more broadly from the young people you're working with and speaking to. I mean, you talked about the loss of some work experience opportunities, for example, because it was illegal to leave your house, for example, and businesses were shut down and things like that. But also, I guess, I feel like probably I've sort of relied on the working from home thing, and I know that's a kind of minority thing, but in general, those more flexible ways of working perhaps are great if you sort of got a decent sized house and a garden, and a bit less so if you're in a small flat share. And also what Jane was saying about missing out on some of those chances to spark off each other a bit more informally. I guess, did you get a sense from the young people you're working with about that balance of pros and cons on those different ways of working?
Yeah, definitely. There was some really strong opinions that it wasn't, right. It wasn't for them, the young people, for our young people to be working from home. They're stuck in a bedroom. They sleep there, they're working there. There was no disassociation between home life and work life. And Jane, you're absolutely spot on. And I did snigger about the comment about having to carefully word an email so you don't offend someone. I was speaking to a graduate last night at an event, and they were saying that they find it so much easier now being back in the workplace, that they can just approach someone and ask a very quick question about, is this right? If I do it this way, will this work? Or whereas before they were having to write the email, wait for the email response, schedule a Zoom, or didn't want to bother someone by picking up the phone. So there was that whole lot of learning lost, right, in that working from home. But I think, one of the key findings in our report was the lack of technology that young people have. There was this instant everybody worked from home, and for some employers that was great. It was about laptops being sent home and screens and keyboards, and if you were lucky, your office chair got delivered to you. But there were some people that they're sharing a device. If you're an apprentice and you've got to share a device with your sibling or with your parents, how can you fully immerse yourself into that work environment still? You can't do it.
Great, thanks, James. Unfortunately, we've got loads more questions we could go through, but unfortunately we're out of time, and I'm aware that people will be on to their next Zoom probably in a couple of minutes time or so. So I mean, that was a really great discussion. We got into so many issues there. I feel like we could have gone on for a lot longer, and the good news is that the work of the Better Work Network goes on, so we will be doing lots more work on these issues, and we want to keep engaged and involved with everyone through this as we look to see what good work looks like after the pandemic, hopefully after the pandemic. So a huge thank you to Jane and to James and to Naomi, and also to Clara and to Rajesh for all of their input through the course of this discussion. That's why we've had a rich discussion, I think. Also, a huge thank you to everybody who's dialed into the event and contributed all that massive list of questions that I've tried to get through, as many issues raised within there as we've been able to. So please do stay engaged with the work that we're doing. This is really important stuff. I think it's not gone away during the pandemic. What it looks like is different as we come through that and into recovery, but we'll be doing lots more work on this as we go through. So do stay engaged, and you can sign up via our website to the Better Work Network if you wish to do so as well. And you haven't already done so, I'm sure you must have already done so, surely. I'm sure everyone has. And a huge thank you again, of course, to the Trust for London for their support for this event, but also for the whole of the Better Work Network. We can't do any of it without that support. So thank you to the Trust for London. So really important set of issues, lots for us to work collectively on. We're keen to keep doing that. So please let's all stay engaged on this and make sure that the recovery benefits all Londoners, and we improve the quality of work as well as the quantity of work. So thank you so much for taking part, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.